Hello everybody, I'm The Last Pretender, and today we're going to be continuing our unit series and talk about the different types of damage you're primarily going to see on your units. Now, I'm not going to cover all the different types of damage, so there's also shock, for example, poison, fire, that kind of thing. I'm not going to be going into those, okay? Those are more magical. I'm just going to be going over the mundane, which is piercing, slashing, blunt, okay? And this is going to cover the majority of things you're going to see on your unit cards. Things get a little funnier, obviously, when you get into spells, but this is a unit series. We're sticking to units. But before I go into that, I'm actually going to cover something entirely different. Well, not entirely, but a little different, which is hit location. Now, whenever you're looking at hit location, the way that it works is actually fairly simple. So, let's say you have two human-sized combatants, and the attacker lands a hit. In that instance, there's a 50% chance that the attacker hits the torso, a 20% chance that he hits one of the arms, another 20% chance that he hits the legs, and then the final 10% are the odds that he actually gets a headshot and hits the opponent in the head. That's a good general concept to kind of keep in mind, which is that about 1 in 10 times you're going to hit the head. That's kind of the most important of all those facts, but it's something to keep in mind. Now, this isn't only important to weapon damage, because it's also going to be important depending on what kind of afflictions you take. So, obviously, for example, you're not going to lose an eye if the damage done that would have given you an affliction hit you in the leg, right? It's going to be a different kind of affliction at that point in time. Same thing if you're going to look at like a chest wound or losing an arm or whatever the case may be. Now, this is for two human-sized attackers. In the event that not everybody is human-sized, it's a little bit different. And basically, it just cuts off different things that you can hit. So, in order to be able to hit your opponent in the head, you have to add up the attacker size plus the weapon length. And it has to be the same, or obviously greater, as the size of the opponent they're striking. So, your average human is a size 2. If he has a sword that has a length of 1, he can hit an enemy that is 3 or lower in the head. Okay? If the enemy's a 4, can no longer hit him in the head. So, in the event that you're one size lower, that number that you added together is one size less, is one less than the size of your opponent, then you can only hit in the torso, legs, and arms. If it is 2 less, you can hit the arms or the legs. And if it's 3 less, you can only hit the legs. So, a good example is, like I said, you're a human, you have a length 1 weapon. If you're fighting a monster or something that's a size 6 or greater, but if it's a size 6, then you can only hit it in the legs because it's 3 higher than you. Well, it's three higher than your combination of your size and your weapon length. Okay? Now, let's go ahead and hop on over to the different types of weapon damage. Okay. So your 3 different types of weapon damage we're going to be looking at, like I said, the mundane ones, are slashing, piercing, and blunt. So let's go ahead and knock out blunt first. So blunt basically works just as I described it did, majority of the time. However, blunt weapons do have 2 modifiers that come into play. The first one is whenever a blunt weapon scores a headshot, however much damage gets through past the protection value, you increase that by 50%. So if 4 points of damage got through the protection value, then you don't actually do 4 damage, instead you do 6. So that's blunt's big advantage. They also do 25% more damage whenever it's 25 more damage is gone towards the shield's destruction whenever they score a strike. So blunt weapons, I think they're a little unremarkable, honestly. I'm not as huge of a fan because their modifier only shows up 1 in 10 times during a hit, and it doesn't show up at all whenever an opponent is larger than you, because you can't hit the head, right, if the opponent's too big. So I kind of find that blunt weapons are kind of the weakest form of weapon damage, personally. There are many who disagree, and this can vary particularly in certain instances. However, I will tell you, so I'm not going to go into this right now, but there are certain spells that basically, like, there's one, I forget what it's called, but it basically makes rocks fall from the sky. And if your army isn't wearing helmets, then it's very likely that they get hit in the head during this time period, and they'll actually take a bunch a bunch more damage than normally. So, and of course, because they're not wearing helmets, they don't have any protection. So it's a really powerful spell, particularly in early age. But I'm not going to go into that right now. What I will say is that I find that whenever evaluating units, I think blunt is the least valuable of the different weapons types. Then you have slashing. Slashing is its modifier always applies whenever you get through an opponent's protection value. So anytime you get through an opponent's protection value, they do 25% more damage. So very, very useful. Anytime you score damage, you're automatically going to get through. They also do 50% more damage to shields, so they're pretty good against shields. They're the best weapon type whenever you're trying to damage an opponent's shield, which is very rarely your goal, right? You're trying to kill the opponent. But it's a helpful thing to keep in mind. And then the other interesting thing that slashing weapons have is they have a interesting little rule. So if you hit someone with a slashing weapon in the arms, legs, or head, and that damage output is more than or equal to 50% of your opponent's total hit points, that body part's chopped off. So you can chop off. You can kill an opponent, right? If you do the amount of damage that you deal is greater than or equal to half their hit points, then you chop off that opponent's appendage. So a pretty cool little modifier aspect to it. So slashing damage, I would say pretty good, right? I would say pretty good. However, it does not compare, in my opinion, to my favorite type of weapon damage, which is piercing. Piercing weapons, the way that their modifier works is that it always applies. Not just if you do damage, it always applies. Whenever a piercing weapon strikes an opponent, that opponent, the calculation that's done for that particular attack has their protection reduced by 20% before any numbers are done. So if you're attacking an opponent with a spear and they have, let's say 20 protection, it's immediately cut down to 16, like instantaneously for that attack, right? It's still 20. It's still 20 to everybody else, but for that particular attack, it's immediately cut down to 16. So a really powerful thing in my opinion, and it really helps you catch up. And obviously, the higher the values go, as far as the higher the protection value goes, the more it's going to reduce that armor class by. So it's very, very useful. Now I will say one thing that is easy to make the mistake of is piercing damage is not the same as armor piercing. So a spear does piercing damage, but certain things, certain like spells and that kind of stuff are armor piercing. What that means is it reduces the protection not by 20%, but by 50%. It's a lot better. Yeah, that's basically how that works. And so one other thing that I didn't quite mention, I don't know if I mentioned this in the last video or not, but whenever dealing with two-handed weapons, just a reminder, this is I mentioned it because it's actually in the manual where I was studying up for this, and it's something that I don't know if I don't remember if I mentioned in the previous video or not. But whenever you strike with a two-handed weapon, you don't just add your strength, you add your strength plus 25% of your strength, plus an additional 25% of your strength. So if your strength is an 8, you don't just add 8 to your damage, you add 10 to your damage. Okay, so just something to keep in mind. Two-handed weapons basically do more damage. I bet you figured that out, or could have at least guessed it. So we're going to cut on over and take a look at the actual game, at some units, so that we can kind of look at units and kind of get a little bit better of an understanding of how they actually work. Alright, so here we are in the game, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at Satis right here. This is MA Satis, and I want to take a look at two units in particular so that we can kind of have a good example of why you would choose one weapon type over another and kind of the thought process that might go into it. So let's look at right here the Elite Warrior. He has a trident that does a weapon damage of 20. And we have our Falchineer, who has a falchion that has a weapon damage of 18. Now, they both have a second attack, but for the sort of ease of thinking about things, we're just going to pretend like they only have one. Now, you might say, obviously, well, the Elite Warrior has a trident that does 20 damage. That's 2 more damage than our Falchineer. I should always go with the Elite Warrior. And that is true in many cases, but it's not always true. So, things to think about. If you're going up against an opponent that has very high protection, then, oh yeah, certainly, you're much better off going with the piercing damage because you're more likely to get that damage through. Whereas you might just not even get to the starting line if you've got slashing. The next thing to think about is what if they have very low protection. Very low protection, like let's say they have 0 protection. There's some weird things I think that have that. But there's also like, these guys are like 3, which is pretty close to 0. Then this guy's gonna get a damage boost that's quite significant, right? Assuming that the DRNs are equal, this guy's gonna end up doing 22 damage on a hit, as opposed to this fellow who's still gonna only do his 20. Because his piercing bonus isn't going to help him at all against opponents that of which have very, very low protection values. Similarly, you might want to think about whether or not they have a shield. You know, this guy's got a big honking shield, parry value 4. It might be hard for you to hit that, right? It might be hard for you to get a hit past the shield, and so that shield's going to cause a lot of problems. Slashing is going to help damage that shield faster, right? A good deal faster, in fact. So, these are kind of things to think about. You know, and obviously, you know, you want to bring the right tool for the right job, and so if you kind of know what you're going to be fighting, you can end up making better decisions about what your unit composition would best be. Now, another thing to look at. Let's actually go back and take a look at. We can actually stay here. Bandar. Yeah. Okay. So this fella has a mace that does 20 damage. Okay, so is that better or worse? Alright, so they all do 21 damage. So, is that better or worse than our Elite Warrior who has a damage of 20? Well, it does 1 more damage, sure, but it depends on the opponent. If you're fighting, for example, a giant, right? Like, let's say this dude. This dude's got a lot of protection, right? It's not going to be as helpful. The giant's actually not quite big enough. Let's say, for reasons that I don't have a great explanation for, let's say you're fighting up against Niflheim here, and you've got this giant who has a size 5. Well, that Bandar, he's only got a weapon length of 1 with his mace, right? And he's a size 3. He can't hit this giant in the head. He can't do it. So he'll never get his bonus damage. Not ever. Whereas the piercing damage is going to get to be applied on every single time he attacks, right? And, you know, it's not bad with a 15 protection, right? The slashing is going to be able to get through the shield a little bit faster and damage it, which can be helpful. So it all just kind of depends on where you want to be with this, right? But these are all important things to think about. Now, if you're fighting Satis, right, and you're going up against one of these with bludgeoning, right, you're a lot better off because a hit in the head is going to, like, insta-kill this thing, right? Assuming DRM rules are even close, even in the same ballpark. A headshot is going to instantly kill this guy because he doesn't have a hat on. Same thing if he's fighting this dude, right? Boom, headshot gone because of how strong that is. Now, another thing to think about, and one of the reasons that I really dislike bludgeoning damage, generally speaking, is that, yeah, bludgeoning damage is going to do an additional 50% damage on a hit to the head. But if you have a slashing weapon, and, like, a lot of times you're going to be fighting stuff that's not going to have a ton of hit points. Just, if you were fighting this guy with a slashing weapon, and you hit for 9 damage, it's an insta-kill. Because it cuts his head off. He's dead. Whereas hitting him in the head, it's actually not going to be an insta-kill with 9 points of damage. It's going to get him most of the way there, but it won't finish him all the way. Depends on the roundings. I think it rounds down, so I think it'd be an additional 4. But in any event, you're not going to kill him. So slashing is better in that regard, depending on if you think you can get that half. These are all things that you can kind of think about. Like I said, I don't particularly value bludgeoning very much. Though, I will say bludgeoning damage tends to be your highest damage, right? Your game kind of tries to make up for that a little bit. Obviously, that's not always true, but things to think about. I will say, particularly if you don't know what you're going to be fighting against, then it's kind of best to just go with whatever has the highest damage output. So, like, this guy has 2 attacks. He has a little bit higher damage output. A lot of people would prefer to go with this guy. But then you're going to have to look at gold and other things like that. But if you're just looking at damage output, usually bigger numbers are more gooder. So that's something to kind of think about. This is also something, I will say this is definitely something that's helpful in province defense. So for example, if I'm going up against province defense, I really like to have slashing in my army. Just a little bit, you know, in case I end up fighting against barbarians who usually don't wear a lot of armor. Or I'll have archers, because archers can shoot them from range and they don't have shields, right? Basic kind of things that of which you can use the same ideas that we've gone over in this video and in previous videos to kind of help make your decisions. And I highly recommend you think about this when it comes to expansion. And the reason being is because expansion is the one phase where there's no player involvement. So it's the one phase you have the most control over, interestingly enough. So things to think about, right? It's the most static of phases of the game. And so it's something that can kind of, you can perfect more easily than anything else because there's no players who are interfering. Anyway, let's go ahead over back to the chalkboard and wrap this up. Okay, so we've talked about the different types of weapon damage and kind of the different benefits that each one of them has. Like I said before, I value piercing, but that's in part because I don't value damage dealt towards shield destruction. I don't really care about breaking shields, but maybe you do, or maybe that's going to be important, right? If your opponent has a very high parry value on their shield, maybe you're going to want a slashing damage to hack through that. It's going to be kind of up to you at that point, but at least you have all the information. And I'm sure smarter heads will tell me how I'm wrong, because I probably am. But with all that said, there's one other kind of unusual case. Well, I guess not unusual for some nations, but a different case all the same that I actually didn't even know about until I started making this video, which is the effects that different weapons experience
underwater. That's right. Different weapon damage types are affected whenever they're underwater.
So, how does this actually play? You just take an attack penalty. It's not a damage penalty. It's just your basically your odds to hit. You get a 1 attack penalty for the weapon per weapon length. So if you have a weapon length of 2, then you have a -2 to your attack whenever you're underwater, unless it's piercing. Piercing is not affected by being underwater. If it does both, if it does like piercing and slashing or whatever the case may be, then the penalty is just halved, right? So if it, let's say it has a weapon length of 2 and it's both slashing and piercing, it has only a -1 instead of a full -2 if it were just slashing, okay? And instead of a 0 if it were just piercing. And that's about it. There's really not a lot more to talk about unless you're going to start getting to different magic or fire damage or poison or stuff like that. So hopefully now whenever you take a look at a unit, you look at their weapons, you have a better understanding of the value of that particular weapon. So with all that, I hope you have a great day and take care.